So that controversy plays out here on Earth between those who will and will not take responsibility for the direction of DNA. So basically, by making the choice where you're going to take responsibility for the direction of your own DNA, you essentially vote in these Orion Wars, which on Earth is called Arab-Israel, but it's a microcosm of a bigger conflict. The Greys, or the Coomer, of which there were many different species, came from Zeta Reticuli, and they had suffered under the genetic engineering of the Alpha Draconis here centuries ago, actually millennia ago. So the Greys were at the stool pigeons of Alpha Draconis here. So, for example, when they said the Greys tricked Eisenhower and Truman into accepting abductions after World War II, here's Eisenhower, right? He just won World War II, and then they staged a show for him, showing them that the Greys, ETs, could swat his best aircraft like flies, right? So Eisenhower had such a huge ego, he couldn't admit to the world that he won World War II and lost to the ETs. So instead, he signs on the dotted line and says, okay, you can do abductions. And a few months later, he finds all his best military leaders have been shape-shifted out. There's a detail.
Can you comment on David Icke?
Yeah, I think David Icke is right. I think if you take David Icke and Gardner together, you get a little picture there. And the Montauk survivors, right? The worst thing to do is ignore it. That you should not do. That to me, that's head in the sand, kids. It ain't appropriate, right? So what happens is here, the Dracos used the Greys as kind of stool pigeons to trick Eisenhower and Truman into accepting that treaty. The Draco who was in charge supposedly was a guy named Typhon, which you can read a book about in the book called Genesit in the Holy Blood, Holy Grail series. The other Draco that was involved later was named Charlie. He was the one who ran the Montauk thing. And they were abducting teenagers to steer the time chair. Very educational piece of the puzzle there. Why did the Dracos from Alpha Draconis need human teenagers to steer the time chair at Montauk? Anybody know? Pardon? Well, organ energy, it had to do with the fact that precisely the inability to have DNA that's up to speed enough to travel in time is their soul group fractionation problem. Their fallen DNA, lack of ensoulment, meant that they could not steer the time chair. In fact, the name for the guy that could steer the time chair at Montauk, and all he did is he sat inside a big capacitor that looked like this, called the decadelta antenna. You sit inside a capacitor like this, and the acceleration is called time travel. Well, the guy that sat in there to steer was called the time empath. So it is empathy that sucked into you through the speed of light, the experience in time. And the empath is one who had the most empathy. Well, they could predict in advance which teenagers they could abduct to steer the time chair by doing a spectrum analysis of their DNA, which is what I propose we do to prove to the genetic engineers they're costing our children their soul. And that spectrum analysis was called a boson 7 frequency signature, which was a log function of 7 in the braiding algorithm of the DNA that indicated the high gene for bliss. And so you could tell in advance who could travel in time and not come back scrambled eggs. Right? So from this point of view, a lot of the religious experience on Earth is mostly an astral milkhouse. Yeah? And that many people think, well, if I went to church and I got my astral juices sucked out of me, I did a service. Not necessarily, right? It's when you can steer your own astral bliss and take responsibility for the direction for that you're no longer susceptible to parasites. So this is the whole little piece of the puzzle, little brief summary overview now of a picture that brings us up to the present time. So what happens? Well, the lineage of Tutankhamun, later called Jesus, was a bloodline of Thoth, who had a Nubian dark blue blood from Rigel in Orion, actually. And Thoth's children, through what was later called Jesus and Magdalene, become the royal families of Europe for maybe 1,000 years. That's called Holy Blood, Holy Grail. So in effect, this Alpha Draconis family is breeding our royal families like we were show dogs for 2,000 years, right? Not necessarily an insult to us, just interesting, right? Well, what happens is the blue blood of the Mag lineage becomes the story of Black Madonna in southern France, yeah, where the Marys went after the Jesus Tutankhamun story was over. And that lineage of those blue bloods, they used copper to hold oxygen in their blood more than the iron. The original story was that the blood was chlorophyll green blazed, and then when they were forced underground by an earlier nuclear catastrophe here, described in the Vedas, that some of them went underground and used iron to hold oxygen in the blood. Scandinavia, Iron Man, Adamic race, the red race. Whereas the remnant humanoids at that time went to Sirius and Pleiades, and it's from there that we get this On bloodline. And there they used more copper than iron to hold oxygen in blood and became the blue bloods. And what's interesting is the blue bloods wanted lower oxygen in their atmosphere than the red bloods. And so during a certain time in the Orion Wars, it was literally called the Oxygen Wars because the reptilian shapeshifters can't handle high oxygen in their environment. I specifically recommend that you pass a law that all voting done in your Congress happen in an atmosphere higher than 15 to 18% oxygen because all the reptilian shapeshifters would be out of your senators. Okay? It's very simple. It's very simple. Yeah? And so very few people know this. But the physics is the fact that high oxygen is a way to select for high-grade DNA, because low-grade DNA, as we say, cannot withstand the presence of implosion. Finishing the story, so the remnants of the Templars, which was an organization set up to worship Magdalene, which was basically honoring the dragon line, okay, founds this Gothic cathedral array honoring the tantric swoon of Magdalene, and the day the largest navy on the planet disappears under the Skull and Bones crossbone, which is the Skull and Bones of Magdalene. Remember, this Orion Queen syndicate used a skull touch, the capacitive spark gap between skulls, to convey long-term memory when the Hive Queen would pass on the lineage. And this became the rite of Baphomet of the Templars. Well, the Skull and Bones Navy was the largest on the planet, and they had invented, quote-unquote, insurance and banking on this planet. Whereas, in fact, the Orion contingent had used insurance and banking. This contingent had used insurance and banking to parasitize hundreds of planets. It wasn't invented on Earth at all. The point is that the Skull and Bones Navy, the largest on the planet, that invented insurance and banking, which paid for the Gothic cathedrals, did the same activity then under the pirates' flagship, the same Skull and Bones. And if you give insurance and banking bad public relations, it's called piracy and extortion. But it's the same activity, or the industry of fear in that sense, right? So this then becomes the story of Holy Grail across the Atlantic, origin of navigating by the stars, and the final book, Pandora's Box, which is how the children of Magdalene and Jesus, Tutankhamun, Oxenfree become the royal families of England, France, and Russia. And the royal family of England then, after Louis XV, comes to America under the name Daniel Pacer, settles at the tailbone of the Eagle, finances a railroad cartel, and becomes the Rockefellers. There's several hundred pages of documentation. And of course, the railroad cartel would be a way you could create hive mind because you'd short out magnetic lines. And the Archons was a name for the winged on, Archon, which became the word Arkansas. And Ozarks were literally the Ozark Mountains. And the Archons at Arkansas, the Rockefellers there, was the bloodline, the illegitimate son of Winthrop Rockefeller, which is the story of Clinton, I believe. And you see the story kind of come up into the present. So the Skull and Bones of that was the CIA were always, in the case of the pirates and the Templars, were always concerned with the drug cartel because it was regulating access to the corridors of psychokinesis in the magnetic wormholes of the planet. So this origin of the CIA with the Skull and Bones and the drug cartel, you get the kind of a picture here that there's an interventionist agenda that begins to fall apart at the moment you realize that only high-quality DNA can survive compression. So now with the onset of the solar maxima, there's a ring past knot here. The end of the story is that between now and 2012, with lots of fire, even 2004, 2006, you have the solar maxima, the rapture we've been discussing. And that experience is a compression wave that essentially tests DNA for compressibility. And the survival of that compression, similar to surviving death, occurs to those who get the hygiene necessary to achieve charge density. Remember, charge density and non-destructive compression are identical. So the act of preparing to die is the same as the activity of preparing for the solar maxima. If the magnetism in your backyard is not fractal, then under the conditions of compression, it will generate heat. So cities whose magnetic lines are not fractal will generate so much heat that the people will go rapidly insane in them. And so this process of preparing for compression is an appropriate way to find out what elements of the gene pools have star inhabiting capabilities and thus are able to be saved or harvested